I'm Sam Dunaiski. I'm the Executive Director here at Renew Wisconsin. Welcome to the Getting Around the Meter breakout session. We've got some great panelists lined up for you today. We're going to be having a great discussion about, I'm going to be talking a little bit about sort of the whole decarbonization of the grid. We talked a little bit about that in our net zero study. And then I'm going to use that to pose some questions to our panelists here. But a lot of it is going to be involving sort of individuals and just kind of what we can all do on our own meters to help decarbonize the electricity sector. So to start off, we have Amalia Hicks. Amalia is the principal in Cadmus's Energy Services. She has had more than 20 years of experience in research and study design. She leads Cadmus's pilots and technology assessment practice from their Madison, Wisconsin office. Welcome, Amalia. Catie Malcheski next. Catie has been project developer with SunVest since 2017. She focuses on community education, marketing, system design, and grant writing. Welcome, Catie. And last but not least, we have Steve. Steve Nieland is the Vice President of Innovation for EnTech Solutions, the energy division of Faith and Technologies Incorporated. In his role, Steve is responsible for identifying technologies, policies, and differentiated approaches to drive innovative products, processes, and partner solutions for energy system delivery, monitoring, and performance. So let's give a warm round of applause to our panelists today. So at this point, I'm going to turn the mic over to Catie, and she's going to give us a little bit more of an introduction to herself and SunVest. So Catie, take it away.
All right, thank you, Sam. My name is Catie Malcheski. Like Sam said, I'm a project developer with SunVest Solar. I've been here for about 6 years. Really got my start doing some residential and small commercial projects. And each year since I started, we're doing larger and larger projects where now we're not doing residential at all, not even doing a small commercial. Instead, we're focusing on large commercial and industrial, C&I, as well as utility scale. As you can see in this picture here, this is just part of our team. I was actually employee number 8, but now we're about 55 people. So this is just a small sampling of some of our team members here at the Yahara solar site. This is currently Dane County's largest solar project at 22 megawatts DC, about 17 megawatts AC. So we're pretty proud of this. SunVest's mission is to advance clean energy through cost-effective solar solutions, and we do this through 2 different ways. We do behind-the-meter projects. Sam, we slide forward a couple. We can do one more. Behind-the-meter projects, so projects that are connected directly to a customer's electric infrastructure to offset their bill, and front-of-the-meter applications. So you can see here just a few projects that we've done. We've done a 1 megawatt behind-the-meter for Komatsu, a slightly smaller system for Grassway Organics. This is one of 2 projects we've done for Aspires Hospital. And then front-of-the-meter, those tend to be more utility programs. So you may have heard of the We Energy's Solar Now program. So that is, and I can get into this a little bit more, but that is paying customers to lease their roof or ground space, and then the utility owns and operates that asset. Alliance has a similar program called Customer Hosted. So these are just a couple mechanisms to really help drive the solar industry forward with some of these larger scale programs.
Great, thanks, Catie. Next up, we're going to have Steve.
Thank you, Sam. If you want to go ahead and advance, that's fine. So a little bit about what we are at Faith. We are a 50-year-old company. We started out in electrical construction, moved into electrical systems engineering, moved into automation, low voltage systems, and then we built a separate energy practice starting about 7 years ago, the reason I came to the company. We can provide full service solutions, so everything from modeling to engineering, construction, procurement, and ongoing optimization and maintenance. So I think that's good for the commercial. So we can move on from there. So why storage? So we get a lot of benefits from looking at storage along with solar systems, right? So one is, again, I can utilize the energy off hours. So if I overproduce during the day, typically I'm not getting a good return if I am able to get money from my utility. So I want to try and utilize as much of that on-site as possible to take advantage of offsetting some of that energy spend. I also want to look at this from a demand management standpoint. So again, if I've got spiky loads, a lot of peaks, can utilize that storage to control that peak demand, do peak shaving, if you will. Resiliency. Again, if I've got critical systems that I need to maintain, if I've got issues with my utility service, this can augment the energy I get from the utility and provide on-site resiliency. Can even act, if you will, as a big UPS, for instance, if I've got critical processes in a manufacturing facility or a commercial facility to maintain critical functions within that building. Again, we a lot of times people go, well, I don't need a microgrid that keeps my whole operation going. Well, no, you don't. You don't need storage that keeps your whole operation going either, but at least we can maintain the critical processes, therefore controlling the cost of those solutions as well. Then we look at sustainability, right? So again, lowering carbon footprint, driving to net zero, getting better control of your own energy profile. So again, we can only control with many utilities so much. We have utilities that offer carbon offset programs, but there's a lot of utilities that still don't offer that or don't give it to at a value that I can afford to pay. This helps from that aspect as well. And finally, as we look at what FERC is doing, how do I improve my bottom line by improving maybe on where my energy is being sold to versus the contracts I may have with my utility? Can I take advantage of market pricing, right, and drive that value up? And Sam, I'm going to bother you to hit. And this is going to be painful for you, Sam, because you're going to have your work to do. So again, it's part of energy transformation, too. It's not a case of I've got to do all or nothing. I have to execute a microgrid, or I don't execute a microgrid. Sam, if you could. Again, start out with traditional model. I'm tied up to utility from my site. Then, Sam, if you could hit me again. I can look at adding grid-tied solar, working with people like SunVest. I add grid-tied solar to my installation, helps with that energy cost, helps me source that energy locally. Don't necessarily have the ability, though, to still be resilient. So for that, I start looking at adding, if you would, Sam, some controls in battery storage. Now, again, depending on that battery storage, if it has the ability to generate an anchor resource, it has the ability to be a reference, right? Generate a 60 hertz, 480 volt reference, a frequency and voltage reference. Now I have the ability to be resilient. But it requires some additional steps also, beyond just that local storage and taking advantage of energy. One more time, if you could. Well, it didn't work. It failed. So I have to also look at how I interface with the utility at that point, along with the type of equipment that we're using on the site. So I'll put in protective relay for my interconnection with the utility. Protects both us from the utility. So if the utility goes down, I don't want to backfeed to the utility because I can't supply my entire neighborhood or my business next door with energy from my site. So it isolates my site, but it also protects the utility from us as well. Again, I don't want to feed energy out to the utility when there may be a lineman working upstream from our interconnection point, trying to take care of the problem they have. So that relay protects them as well as protecting us. And I think we're good, Sam.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. All right, Amalia, take it away.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. So I am going to talk a little bit about a study that we did, more than Cadmus itself, but I will tell you that Cadmus is a nationwide company that actually only has only has services that benefit the greater good. So we have a government service sector that works in resiliency and does water quality in various places in the world. And we also have an energy services sector where we do energy efficiency consulting, electrification, EV practice, and what I do, for the most part, is I lead the Wisconsin Focus on Energy evaluation here in Madison, but also have worked with some other Midwestern states like Minnesota. We help them update their TRM, and we do a lot of work with consumers' energy as well. So that's sort of a soundbite about Cadmus. Yeah, you can go on. So a couple of years ago, we performed a rooftop solar potential study for the Wisconsin PSC to try to find out if there's actually some copies of it up at the front, and Joe Pater from the PSC printed out some really lovely bound copies of this study, and there's some of them at the Focus on Energy table as well. So there were a couple of goals to this study. One of them was to help with Focus on Energy program planning to find out exactly how much rooftop solar could be installed, but also, as you'll see a little bit later, we also looked at the market and how much of that possible solar that could physically be installed would likely be adopted by customers. So one of the other objectives was to look at the barriers and opportunities of delivering rooftop solar to underserved populations in Wisconsin. We also wanted to compare the cost effectiveness of rooftop solar PV as kind of as an energy efficiency measure to other measures that Focus on Energy offers, like heat pumps, et cetera, with cost effectiveness, of course, being, how the ratio of the benefits you're getting to the cost of installing something. And then finally, we had 4 stakeholder meetings throughout the study to get input and guidance from the community. Alrighty, so we used NREL's dGen software, or tool, I guess, as the basis of this study. It's very complex, has a lot of data that they already provide for this. They use LiDAR to look at rooftops and orientation of rooftops, and that's how they figure out where solar could be installed on rooftops. They've got population data, weather data to simulate how much solar could be produced after you install it. So we looked at a few different pieces of this. We were able to construct inputs for various pieces of this software that would be able to slice things by residential, commercial, and also disadvantaged community sectors. And then so the software calculates the adoption of the market adoption through something called BAS-style diffusion, but basically that's just a function that takes into consideration early adopters and how fast adoption will happen throughout the market. And the coefficients for that equation were also provided by NREL. And I do want to mention, too, that this study only covers rooftop PV, so not ground-based. So it's, in some ways, the results are going to be, an underestimate of what's really possible. So just to describe the difference between technical potential and market potential, I kind of already mentioned that, but technical potential is if you covered every rooftop in the state with solar panels, and these, I think there were a few orientations that were ruled out. If it's north-facing, it wasn't counted, but if you covered every, rooftop that gets a lot of sun. Oh, also shaded areas were left out too from the LiDAR data. That's what the technical potential is. What could you do? And then the market potential is what fraction of that technical potential we expect to be adopted based on different levers that you can pull with the software. So the segmentation of the results, it goes down to the county level. We also rolled it up to utility service area. And as I said, we can do building segment and income classification. So I'm just jumping to the results because I'm not going to take up the whole 45 minutes with this. But this map shows you where the technical potential is concentrated. Really, it's mostly in areas of Wisconsin that have the most unobstructed square footage of rooftops. 60% of this technical potential, at least on rooftops, is coming from the residential sector, and a third of that residential sector is underserved or lower income populations. And really what's the most exciting news is that if you did cover every roof with solar in Wisconsin, you would be able to make up for 70% of the statewide energy production. So that's really exciting. And that's from 2019, the statewide energy production. It gets a little stickier, if you want to go to the next slide. Oh, and I should also mention that this study covered about a 14-year period. I think it was 2022 to 2034. So once you roll in the market potential, though, you're actually only, this software predicts that only about a few percent of the technical potential is going to be adopted under the conditions as they are now. And of course, that didn't take IRA into consideration or any of the new exciting, this study was done in 2021.
I'll go back to the technical potential again.
Sure. Is there a question? Or just wanted to look? Okay. So I think you jumped ahead one. We were at the, yeah. So you can see as you go from 2026 to 2034, now you can jump, that the adoption really starts to spread more across the state, which is also a great thing. Okay. So if you look at the market potential by customer type, you can see that a lot of the potential is in the residential sector. That's the residential standard income is the black line. And another exciting result, of course, is that the adoption of solar from the point that we calibrated at, which was the existing solar in Wisconsin in 2019 probably also, it goes up by 600% in the next 10 years. And again, this is without IRA, which is, so we can expect to see that line shoot up even more, I think. Okay. So just to wrap up, Wisconsin is in a great spot. We can greatly increase our rooftop solar energy production over the next decade. Technically, we could make up 70% of statewide generation needs. But the market potential under the current conditions deliver just a few percent of that, but it's still 751 gigawatt hours. So, and single-family homes are really where a lot of that potential lies, at least on roofs. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate the presentations there. Before we get into questions, and by the way, we're going to take questions through the app, just like we did in the plenary session. So if you have questions, please start thinking about them and start submitting them now. But I wanted to focus a little bit on the slide that my colleague, Micah Bickerman, had up to kind of set up the questions here. And so this is from Renew's modeling that we did with GridLab, and this kind of shows our autonomy-wide capacity by 2050. So obviously we have to add a lot more generation if we're going to decarbonize our autonomy by 2050. But this is what our modeling shows. So as you can see, we have a lot of solar, a lot of wind as well. But we are talking about behind the meter type operations here. So I want to kind of also highlight, that one right there, rooftop solar. So 2.5 gigawatts by 2050. So that's obviously much different from your market numbers, Amalia. But the first question I want to throw to you is 2.5 gigawatts is obviously ambitious, right? But in the context, in the context of this pie chart, it's also very small, right? So I'm wondering, how we get to that between the technical potential and the market potential. How do you think we can get to 2.5 gigawatts or maybe even more, hopefully?
So one of the things that we looked at in the study was also some scenarios around economic stimulation of the market. One of those was increasing focus on energy incentives. One was making more attractive lending situations. One was extending the tax credits. And then the fourth one was net metering. And of those scenarios that we looked at, net metering was by far the most effective at stimulating the market. It increased the uptake of solar rooftop PV by about 40-some%. Sorry?
Could you define net metering precisely?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, of course.
And you get the same as you pay?
Yeah, so I think, I can't remember what the other term is. It's like billing metering or something. So in the one case, which is what is operating, I think, in most utilities right now in Wisconsin, is if you make more than you use, it goes back to the grid and you get paid at a wholesale rate. Whereas net metering is if you make more than you use, you get paid back at the same cost that you would purchase that energy for. So obviously with net metering, and some utilities do offer that or some form of that, like some of us, I'm sure, in here probably have MG&E, and they will give you credits on your bill if you produce more than you use. So that obviously will help increase or reduce the payback time scale. And what we found in the study is that the payback time scale is the main factor in commercial adoption. Anything that has a payback time scale of less than 10 years, they're probably going to adopt, and anything more than that, probably not. So I think net metering would be one way to accelerate that adoption.
So I want to continue with these questions for all of you of kind of how do we get to these numbers, and I realize they're not your numbers, so I don't expect you to necessarily be able to support this, but I want to go to Catie now because, Catie, I know you worked some in rooftop solar, certainly behind the meter, but I also know that you said you do SunVest and other companies are doing front of the meter installations as well, which would be grouped into that larger orange pie piece. So my question to you is, how do we get to 28 plus 2.5 gigawatts of solar?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution. I think if we're going to get to these really aggressive net zero goals, it's solar and wind and other renewables. It's rooftop and ground mount. It's I think transmission level. These really large, 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt, they play a very important role. But what we're really focusing on, at least at SunVest, is this distribution level. So about 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts. That is going to go a really long way. And we're in a really fortunate position because our large utilities in the state have taken a really aggressive position, and they have really aggressive sustainability goals. And so they said that they want to own and operate these distribution level assets for the life of the asset, so 25 plus years. And so by having, a large goal with these smaller chunks, 1 to 5 megawatts or so, that means you can place these assets in very strategic locations. So it's not in one central location like some of these larger transmission levels, which could be subject to environmental disaster, or some sort of major failure. These are sort of sprinkled throughout the utility territory. They're also strategically located based on local grid infrastructure. So let's say there's a substation that is large enough to handle a significant generation asset. It doesn't need a large financial upgrade. That would be a prime location to put one of these assets, as opposed to somewhere where you're definitely going to have to put millions of dollars into the grid to put a 100 megawatt facility there. So just kind of summarize it. It's a little bit of a lot of things, and then behind the meter, CNI and residential, they all play a role, but together that'll help get us to this 28 gigawatt goal.
Great. Steve, your turn now. How do we get to these numbers for storage? I know whether you want to talk about kind of behind the meter storage or whether you want to talk about utility scale storage. Like, how are you seeing the needle move right now?
So talking about storage in general, so we see this moving on both sides, and I think they complement each other. I mean, to Catie's point, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So again, looking at storage, it's a shift in storage, right? So I have a coal plant that used to be, that We Energies operate about 5 miles from my home, that they decommissioned. And I've heard people say, well, you got to put in batteries because the sun doesn't shine at night, and you got to put in batteries because the wind isn't always blowing. It's like, well, you know what? There's no coal mine in Green Bay, Wisconsin either. That pile of coal does not naturally exist there. It's energy storage. It's the battery, basically, for that coal-fired power plant, right? So when we look at energy storage, that's replacing energy storage we already utilize in different ways. It's just replacing it with hopefully a bit greener way of doing that. Now, to Catie's point also, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not storage by the utility. It's not storage by CNI or by residential, but it's really going to be a combination, I think, that's going to help us achieve these goals. Utilities are looking at this from the aspect of, quite often, from an application of peaking, right? So again, I'm putting energy storage in critical places, either where I know I have resiliency problems in my grid if I'm a utility, so that in the time of grid outage, I can still ensure that community is serviced until I can take care of the issue. Or I'm putting in places where maybe I'm using non-green peaking solutions in critical portions of my grid, like diesel generators, natural gas generators, replacing those assets. So again, how can I take that green energy I'm producing from the solar, save some of that to utilize when I have peak times as well? And then on the back side, on the other side of the meter, it's about if I have a need or a want to, one, make sure I'm green, and two, make sure I'm resilient, it gives me that capability outside of my utility. So really, I think it's a shared kind of profile that's going to make this work. Also want to make a comment, too, as far as net metering. I understand utilities' positions when they talk about true net metering, because, again, they're providing all the infrastructure. If I'm pushing energy back and I'm getting a one-for-one with what I buy, how are they getting compensated for their transportation infrastructure? Because basically, that's what it is, right? It's transporting electrons from one spot to another within their system. Now, is a wholesale rate really fair to me? No. Is it also really fair to the utility for me to ask to have a one-to-one? Probably not. There's some ground in between. And that's something I think we still need to work out from an overall energy infrastructure. But we also, as part of that, we need to understand each other's positions. We can't just say, well, it's ridiculous I get paid 4.5 cents. Well, it's also ridiculous you get paid 14.5 cents because they have to provide all this. Part of that is helping utilities understand that transition to going to being more of a transportation manager of electrons through their system as well. So there's a lot of work to be done. I'm seeing a lot of encouraging things from utilities around that, especially as we look at some of the smaller regionals like MG&E, or Madison Gas and Electric. Much more progressive, much more creative in ways they look at those things.
Thanks. Steve, I want to stick with you and shift over to microgrids. Outside of being just super cool, what role, I should say, do you think microgrids kind of play in this net zero autonomy? Because I think, at least for me, and I assume for other people too, when we hear microgrids, kind of the first thing that comes to mind is resiliency. I mean, you even had that up on your slide yourself. But how does it really come into play when we talk about economy or society-wide?
Sure. So it's interesting. So, you've got both aspects, right? You've got the aspect of in front of the meter. You got the aspect behind the meter. One thing I'm seeing, even within our own state, is utilities looking more at microgrid technology for helping strengthen their system. For instance, Alliant, Village of Boaz, has had historically some issues with supply to that village. So one of the things they have pursued is putting in a battery storage microgrid. Again, it's just a battery system, but it's a battery system that can generate its own frequency, voltage reference, so that when they have transmission line problems, they can still keep the lights on in the village. So they recognize the value of that. Looking at California, they really are understanding the value of small and large microgrids. They've got issues with high fire areas. Those transmission lines are a liability for them. Again, there's been millions and millions of dollars, lives lost because of those fires. They're starting to realize that, I don't need to maintain 20, 30 miles of transmission lines to these small communities in the foothills. I can locate a microgrid there. And so, you look at what PG&E has done. They have a very aggressive program for those small 20, 30, 40 kilowatt microgrids to service those small communities and eliminate the transmission lines, lowering their liability and also improving the reliability of service. So there's that piece on the utility side. On the back side, there's also the case of I want more control myself. I may still have critical processes. If I'm a manufacturing site, let's say I'm doing heat treating or I'm doing food processing, that if I lose power for 20, 30 minutes, I have hundreds of thousands of dollars of lost product and lost productivity. And again, it's strategically applying the technology. I said earlier, we don't have to apply it to a whole site, but I can say, I'm going to utilize my microgrid, and normally I'm going to utilize that solar and the battery storage to handle just lowering my energy cost overall, maybe do peak shaving to do demand management, but I'm going to reserve a portion of that storage. I'm going to hold it back so that in case I do have an outage, I can finish running that batch of parts from my heat treating line. It's not going to power my whole plant, but it's going to power those critical loads. It's going to power my food processing line, my cheese line, until I can clear out that product again so I don't have a major cleanup and sanitization event. So there's great ways we can apply this technology. And again, it's also providing help for utilities too, because it's not all on the utilities then to supply their energy needs. And as we look at what's going to be happening now with EV charging and the strain that's going to put on the grid, I think that localized generation and that ability to do that is going to help the utilities relieve some of that stress they're going to feel on their grid.
Speaking about utilities, Catie, I know there are some utility-offered DG programs out there. Can you talk a little bit more about those for folks that might not be able to do solar on their own house or on their own business or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say We Energy's really kicked off the DG programs with their solar now. So for those of you that don't know, it's a 35 megawatt pilot program where they are leasing roof and ground space from their customers. So they'll go to cities or counties that have available ground space. They've gone to large commercial customers that have a significant amount of load, like the Harley-Davidson powertrain facility in Menominee Falls is one example. We did a 2.25 megawatt there. So that has sort of given us a lot of opportunity to do many different medium-sized projects throughout We Energy's territory. That worked out really well for them. Shortly thereafter, Alliant Energy adopted a similar program called Customer Hosted. So we're actively developing projects for that as we speak. One of them is actually utilizing agrivoltaics alongside the photovoltaics, so growing crops under and around the solar, which presents some really cool opportunities. But I think what this does, and those programs have been successful, that other utilities are looking to them as an example. So there is a tariff in front of the PSC right now to expand the We Energy Solar Now program from a pilot to sort of a set program. It also opens up other markets, other utilities, and I think it helps to encourage smaller utilities that may not have the same sort of capital stack that some of these larger IOUs have. It might encourage them to consider projects like this. So municipal utilities, co-ops, things like that, especially with the IRA having direct pay options for some of these nonprofits or non-taxable entities, these munis, these co-ops. They can really start to consider DG programs like some of the larger utilities have utilized. And so this way we're just continually perpetuating the solar momentum forward.
So for those of us that don't want to rely on the utility, Amalia, you talked a little bit about some of the carrots in that market potential. Can you just expand a little bit more about those, just to kind of talk about which ones were the ones that you really saw driving adoption forward in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think I covered that a little bit in the last answer, which, showed that the net metering was the one that was the scenario that we ran that was the most effective. And what I would like to do if we redo this potential study again is see if the software would enable us to model third-party solar, because I think that especially in the case of disadvantaged communities, that is a good way to get solar on those roofs. And that was part of the study that I didn't actually get to talk much about just in the interest of time, but we did do a specific focus on marginalized communities and how we could promote solar rooftop adoption in those communities. And one of the barriers that we found was, of course, rooftops sometimes are not stable enough to support solar in underserved communities. So if you bundle maybe make a package of like, we're going to also stabilize your roof or upgrade your electric panel along with installing solar, that's a good way to get to reach the potential of those communities and the third party. But also probably the biggest barrier for that segment is just upfront cost. So if there's a way to increase incentives or the third party piece. Also, there's multifamily housing is a tough nut to crack as well, because then you have the owner versus the tenants. So there's a thing called virtual net metering, which can be done to spread the benefits of solar that's on a multifamily building, which might not have individual meters for the different different apartments within it.
So my last question for all of you before I turn it over to the audience questions, real brief because I've been bad at budgeting my time. So, but how do you each foresee the IRA affecting your individual fields of work? Steve, why don't you go first?
We see it having some fairly dramatic impact. Again, there's some great incentives, especially because we work across a number of spaces, including the EV charging space. And that's where we see a lot of good potential opportunity for advancement. Again, it's not just about installing EV chargers, but it's about how do I supply the energy to the EV chargers and developing those right solutions. And I think IRA is going to go a long way towards helping with that adoption, but also getting the right infrastructure in place as well.
So like I mentioned before, I think it's really going to help get some of the utilities, the munis, of the co-ops sort of over that financial hump. Maybe they've considered solar, maybe they haven't. Maybe they see this as a good way, a good investment now that they can get that direct pay. But what I think is really exciting, and I feel like we talk about this a little bit more each year at these policy summits, is the environmental justice aspect. So with the IRA, there are potential adders if you build in a low-income area or an energy community. So that's an area that has a retired coal plant or a retired coal mine. These marginalized communities have been stuck with coal for their entire lives, and now they have an opportunity to support renewable energy. So I think that's really exciting. I think we're going to see just solar sort of sprinkled out, all over the country.
Yeah, IRA's going to burst everything right open. It's going to affect all of us in this room probably, right? And it's so exciting. I think in terms of my job. It's might make things a little bit more complicated because if we just talk about evaluation of focus on energy, which I know is not completely related to this topic, but there's so much money pouring into energy efficiency and renewables. How do you separate out what the root cause is of somebody adopting a measure like solar? Is it focus on energy? Is it IRA? So it'll make things complicated, but it's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I think it kind of puts on some pressure on the people like we are to help our customers understand execution, that putting that energy solution isn't necessarily the best thing to do. To your point, let's take care of the low-hanging fruit. Let's make sure that I've got a good, tight building envelope. Let's make sure I've done the right thing with lighting. Let's sure I'm doing the right thing with building controls, et cetera. Because one, they're more cost effective, and two, they reduce the need for a larger energy system. So those things are not mutually exclusive, and for us, that's something we want to try and execute on the front end to make sure we're doing the right solution in the end.
So I apologize, first of all. You guys are great question askers, but my app has failed at just the right time. So bear with me for 1 second. But
so it's a free-for-all now?
I guess it's just I guess it's just a round table. Here, give me 1 second. I think I had some up. Okay. First question is for you, Amalia. Did the Cadmus study also capture the effects of energy lost due to snow coverage on roofs, particularly flat roofs using ballasted mounting?
Well, good question. I wish someone from NREL was in here. There is weather baked into their model, and I am not 100% certain whether or not snow cover was something that was part of that weather spreadsheet, but I can find out. So whoever asked that can email me.
I believe it does, because I'm familiar with the model.
Oh, you
we
are?
work
Okay,
with that
great.
model also. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So it does take that into account.
Snow? Okay.
Yeah.
So Steve, this question is more for you. What is the relationship, and you touched on this a little bit, what is the relationship between solar net metering policy and energy storage? Having a poor sellback rate seems to support energy storage economics, yet at the same time, the resiliency economic valuation of energy storage and microgrid is unclear.
So I think in answer, what is going to make that work more attractively for behind the meter? As we look at FERC 2222 and the ability to now sell into energy markets, not just have that relationship with my local utility, but be able to basically get more for that energy, I think that's going to help stimulate a lot of the behind the meter storage. Because if I can, again, participate in 24-hour look ahead and look at tomorrow afternoon, I can sell my energy if I put in the bid now for a couple hours for 20 or 30 cents a kilowatt hour, versus getting less than a nickel, I'm going to cover 2 or 3 days worth of energy sales in that 2-hour period, right? So now it starts to really help that payback. And to the point earlier, the more I can narrow in that 10-year window to a 5 or a 4 or a 3-year window really has a huge impact on how commercial and industrial facilities approach this behind the meter solutions.
Interesting. Catie, this one is for you. Are there other Wisconsin utilities with programs similar to WE's Solar Now program? How have those programs impacted SunVest's ability to generate projects?
So right now, the only other one we're working on would be Alliance customer hosted. But we're still in the development phase. We haven't actually gotten any posts in the ground yet. Like I mentioned, WPS has a proposed program that's sitting in front of the PSC right now. Hopefully we'll hear sometime this quarter. And I think that others will follow suit. And I mean, outside of Wisconsin, we're seeing other opportunities like community solar gardens. Third-party ownership has really sort of opened the doors and given greater market opportunities in other states. But we're not quite there yet in Wisconsin.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. I think you can all participate in this one. I'm remembering that a few years ago, utilities viewed DG as an annoyance. They didn't feel they could rely on that energy, and so their transmission and distribution costs would be the same after DG is installed. Has this changed? How do you think utilities will help or hinder this movement?
I guess I'll go first. I'll partake first. I don't work for a utility, but I work with them fairly frequently, and I think that DG is a challenge in that, I mean, you mentioned this before in terms of peak. You know, it doesn't always coincide with when the energy is needed. I think storage is going to help with that a lot, but really the future of the grid has to be a smart grid in order to really take advantage of distributed generation.
Yeah, and I think as the years have gone on, it's been proven that solar is reliable. And now there's an economic case that solar does work in Wisconsin. That's probably one of the most frequently asked questions is like, does solar work in Wisconsin where you see the sun 50% of the year? And you know, when you tie the kilowatt hours that are produced, albeit they are fewer than if, you know, same system size as in Arizona, if you tie those kilowatt hours that are produced to our electric rates, there is, you know, it does pencil out. And so utilities see this as an opportunity, you know, not to mention with supply chain shortage and, you know, geopolitical conflicts and other things like that are making more traditional fuel sources more expensive. This is now, you know, at cost parity, and it just makes financial sense to do this, to go solar and to go wind.
Yeah, I have to agree with everything both of you said. Again, utilities are seeing that it makes sense, and they're seeing it makes sense. And maybe, you know, we talked about some more edge case, you know, situations where it is, okay, I've got a community that it is expensive for me to service. This is actually more cost effective. So they're seeing that it doesn't just make sense because it's greener energy, or it doesn't just make sense on a large scale, but even at smaller scale, right? It helps me resolve some really high-cost situations where maybe I've got transmission lines in northern Michigan serving a small community, and I'm going through and repairing those lines due to ice storms 4 or 5 times every season, and the costs involved with that, right? I have more effective ways using DG that I can service those particular areas. We're kind of going full circle, right? We started out with generation in small pockets all over the place, and then went to big generation that was centralized because it's more cost effective to build a big power plant and put in transmission lines. And now we're finding out, hey, you know what? With what we have available now, with the offerings we have, we can flip that now and start moving that out again into smaller areas and make the grid more resilient by doing that. And I think utilities are realizing that. They get that message.
Just like fashion, energy is...
It comes around.
It always comes around.
It always comes around.
Thank you so much. Please, can we have a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you so much. And Dan, the Cadmus study is up here. There's a few paper copies for anyone who wants them. So thanks.
That was...